The bidding had already started when I walked in. I was late. The orbital tram from Gate 7 had been delayed by a fuel inspection, and by the time I pushed through the heavy pressure doors of the Kareth auction house, the auctioneer was already 2 lots in. The air inside smelled like recycled oxygen and money. That particular combination of filtered air and tension that only exists in rooms where serious beings are deciding the fate of serious things. I found a seat near the back, not because I planned to stay out of sight. I just didn't want to be near the front, near the Velchari cluster of buyers in their pale robes and their quiet, superior expressions. I had met enough Velchari in my life to know that they judged you for where you sat before they judged you for anything else. My name is Callum Wright, if you want the full version. Former cargo hauler, former independent freight contractor, and at the time of this story, the operator of a very small and not particularly profitable starship repair business, out of Mira Station's lower ring. I was 34 years old. I had the kind of face that people describe as forgettable, and the kind of mind that couldn't stop chewing on problems until they were solved, or until I fell asleep, whichever came first. I was not supposed to be at the auction. I had come because my friend Petra Dunn, who ran a parts reclamation outfit 2 bays down from mine on Mira, had called me 2 days earlier and told me that Lot 7741 was something I needed to see in person. Petra had a way of saying things that made them sound both obvious and urgent at the same time. I had learned over 4 years of friendship to take her at her word. A Lot 7741, a Velchari heavy cruiser, 111 years derelict, pulled from the Shatter-Arm debris field by a scavenger crew 18 months ago and sitting in Kareth Station's impound yard since then, waiting for someone to either claim it or buy it. The Velchari Conservancy had declined to claim it. They had been notified, they had reviewed the registry documents, and then they had, in the formal language of interstellar property law, let it go. I found out later that the Velchari ambassador to the Kareth Orbital Authority had described the ship as not worth the administrative cost of recovery. I want you to hold that phrase in your head for a while. We'll come back to it. The auctioneer, a tall being of the Korath species, with the flat gray face and the methodical voice they were known for, moved through the first 2 lots quickly. A load of stripped cargo modules, a collection of outdated navigation buoys, minor items. The room was polite but distracted. Most of the serious buyers were waiting. Then the display screen behind the auctioneer shifted to Lot 7741. The image that came up was not impressive. The ship hung in the rendering like something that had lost an argument with the universe and hadn't quite recovered. The hull was split along 2 of its main pressure ridges. The ventral side had a burn pattern running the full length of the ship, old and long cold, but wide enough to tell you something serious had happened a very long time ago. The dorsal fins, Velchari ships have 3, were intact, which was almost the only good thing you could say about it at first glance. The registration beacon was dead. The propulsion core was cold. The navigation AI was listed on the auction sheet as non-recoverable. There were murmurs in the room. Some of them were the Korath version of laughter. The auctioneer gave the standard description in a flat, professional voice. Hull integrity at 42%. Internal atmosphere fully vented. No life support functional. Propulsion systems offline for 111 years, and showing crystalline lattice degradation, consistent with long-term cold exposure. The Velchari Velk series heavy cruiser, he said, had been a significant class of vessel in its time. This example, he said, was not a representative specimen of that class. More laughter. Korath laughter sounds like a series of short exhaled clicks. There were a lot of clicks in the room. The opening bid was set at 8,000 credits, standard for derelict recovery items. The auctioneer waited. Nobody moved. I looked around the room. The Velchari buyers in their robes were completely still. The Korath merchants near the center. There were 3 of them, and I recognized 2 from previous auctions, were not even consulting their tablets. A pair of large beings from a species I didn't recognize were talking quietly to each other, and not looking at the screen. There was a human couple near the left wall who looked like they had wandered in looking for the bathroom and ended up staying. Nobody bid. The auctioneer lowered the opening to 5,000. He waited. Nothing. 4,000. Nothing. 3,000. I looked at the ship on the screen. I looked at the burn pattern on the hull. I looked at the intact dorsal fins. I thought about what Petra had told me, and about something I had read once in a salvage manual. That Velcheri propulsion cores, even degraded ones, contained alloy structures that no one outside the Velcheri Conservancy had ever successfully reverse-engineered, that the internal architecture of a Velcheri core was, from an engineering standpoint, one of the most genuinely interesting unsolved puzzles in interstellar mechanics. I raised my hand. 12,000, I said. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of attention, but the specific quiet of surprise. I felt it land on me like a physical thing. The auctioneer looked at me with the careful, neutral expression of a professional who has been trained to show nothing but who is clearly, somewhere behind his flat gray face, wondering if I had understood what was being offered. 12,000 credits, he confirmed, from the bidder at the rear. He waited for a counterbid. The Quarath merchant nearest to me turned around in his seat and looked at me with large, dark eyes. Then he made the clicking sound, as prolonged. His companion made it too. They were laughing. At me, specifically. I understood that. I did not particularly mind. Nobody countered. The gavel came down. Lot 7741 was mine. I remember the exact feeling of that moment. Not triumph. Not even excitement. Something quieter and stranger. The feeling of having made a decision that was going to cost me a great deal of effort, and that I already knew, somewhere below reasoning, was the right one. It was the same feeling I'd had at 9 years old, when I found a broken motorcycle engine in my grandfather's garage and decided I was going to understand how it worked, even though nobody had asked me to. Even though it took me 6 weeks, and I scraped my knuckles open 4 times. Some things pull at you, not loudly, just steadily, like gravity. I filled out the transfer documents at a booth near the exit. The booth attendant, a young Quarath woman who was professionally pleasant, handed me a hard copy of the registry transfer and a cold storage keycard for the ship's access panel. The keycard was older than I was. The metal was worn smooth on one edge, the way things get when they've been handled a lot and then, for a long time, not handled at all. Outside the booth, I called Petra. She picked up immediately. "You bid on it, didn't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I won it," I said. There was a pause. Callum. 12,000. Another pause. Longer. They let it go for 12,000? Nobody else wanted it. I could hear her breathing. Then, "What are you going to do with it?" I looked at the keycard in my hand. The worn metal. The century of cold and silence that lived in that small weight. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I'm going to find out what's inside it first." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "That's what you always say, and you always end up building something nobody expected." She meant it as a mild warning. I chose to take it as a compliment. The tug I hired to move the ship from Karath Impound to Mira Station was called the Second Chance. The human owner had named it, and I thought that was either appropriate or funny, and couldn't decide which. The transit took 19 days. I spent most of that time reading everything that had ever been published about the Velcheri heavy cruiser class, which was not as much as I would have liked. The Velcheri were not generous with technical information. They shared what made them look advanced and kept quiet about the rest. What I found in the public records was enough to confirm what I had suspected at the auction. The Velke series had been built during a period of rapid Velcheri military development, about 120 years ago. The power core design used during that era had been experimental, a hybrid crystalline lattice with a thermal routing architecture that the Velcheri had apparently abandoned in favor of a simpler, more standardized system after the period of conflict ended. Abandoned because it was inferior? That was the official Velcheri position, mentioned in passing in a 30-year-old academic paper. The paper also noted, in a single footnote, that the experimental cores had shown output potential significantly above the standard models in controlled testing, but that the test program had been closed before long-term field data could be collected. I read that footnote 4 times. When the Second Chance finally docked at Mira Station, and the mooring lines were in place, and I stood at the airlock of the ship for the first time, keycard in hand. The station was quiet around me. It was late shift. The bay lights were low. The hull of the ship rose above me in the dim, enormous and still and damaged and old. I touched the hull with my palm. The metal was cold in the way that things are cold when they haven't been warm in a very long time. "All right," I said, to nobody to it. "Let's see what you've got." I put the key card to the access panel. The panel lit up. That was the first surprise. After 111 years, with no external power source, the emergency access panel still had charge. Some kind of passive power cell the Velchari had built into the panel housing, designed to last, designed to always let someone back in. I filed that detail away and stepped through the airlock into the dark. It took me about 30 seconds to find the emergency lighting toggle. The lights that came on were dim and amber-colored, the Velchari equivalent of emergency illumination. Enough to see by, nothing more. The corridor I was standing in was wide by human standards, designed for beings slightly taller than us, with a ceiling that curved overhead in a way that was less like a built structure and more like something grown. Velchari design had that quality. Organic curves, smooth surfaces, no visible seams. Even in disrepair, even cold and silent, the ship had a feeling of having been made with care. I walked the length of it that first night, all 640 meters. I found things I expected: damage, silence, systems that had been off for over a century. I found things I did not expect. A cargo bay in the rear third that was perfectly intact, sealed behind a pressure door that had held its seal for 111 years without a single leak. A crew quarters section where personal items had been left behind, not scattered in panic, but arranged, placed, as if whoever had left them had taken the time to put things in order before they went. A small room near the bridge that I didn't understand the purpose of until much later, with walls covered in a material I had never seen, and what appeared to be a large, intact display surface that was simply waiting for power. And the bridge. The bridge was the last thing I saw that night, because I saved it. I walked in and stood at the center of it, under that curved ceiling, in the amber emergency light, and looked at the main console. Every surface was intact, not pristine. The dust of a century was on everything, and one section of the console on the right side had buckled under some old pressure event, but present. Whole. The chair at the center of the bridge was still there, facing forward, as if the last person to sit in it had simply stood up and walked away. I know that's strange, but I did. I sat in that chair in the silence and the amber light, and looked at a dead console on a dead ship in a station bay, on a station that orbited a planet that most of the galaxy had never heard of. And I thought about all the places this ship had been that I would never know, all the crew who had walked this bridge, and the decisions they had made here, and the thing that had happened to end it. And then I thought, this is not the end of this ship. This is the part where it gets interesting. I went back to my quarters, slept 4 hours, and at 6 in the morning, I put out a crew call. Petra Dunn was the first person I told, not because I called her first, but because she was standing in my bay drinking bad coffee when I got back from the ship that first morning. And she took one look at my face and said, "You already decided, didn't you?" I told her yes. I told her I was going to restore it, or something better than restore it. I was going to learn what the ship could actually be, now that nobody was going to stop it from becoming that. Petra set her coffee down and said, "I want in." I had known Petra for 4 years. She was 31, had grown up on the agricultural stations of the Outer Belt before working her way into parts reclamation, and had a technical mind that operated differently from mine. Where I pulled things apart to understand their logic, Petra looked at collections of broken pieces and saw what they wanted to be. She was better than me at 3 of the 6 things we would need most, and she knew it without being the kind of person who mentioned it. "I need to be honest with you," I said. "I don't have a full plan yet. I have a ship, a theory, and 12,000 credits less than I had yesterday." "You have a ship that the Velchari couldn't be bothered to recover," she said. "That means they're not going to help you. Not going to sell you parts. Not going to share manuals. You know that. Yes. And you want to do it anyway. I want to know why they gave up on it, I said. I read about the power core, the experimental model they were testing before the war ended. The test program that closed before they got long-term field data. Petra's expression shifted. Not dramatically. She had a still face, the kind that changes at the edges first. You think the core on this ship is one of those? I think it might be, and I think there's a footnote in a 30-year-old academic paper that suggests it might have been better than what they replaced it with. She was quiet for a moment. How long will it take to find out? Weeks to assess, months to understand, years to rebuild, if it comes to that. And you have the money for years? I have the capacity to earn the money for years, I said. There's a difference. But yes, I think so. If we keep the repair business running alongside it. Petra picked her coffee back up and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was her version of thinking hard. Then she looked at me. You're going to need more people. I know. Technical people, real ones, not just handy with tools. I know. And you're going to need someone who knows Velchari systems better than any of us do. I had already thought about that. I had, in fact, already sent a message before I left the ship that morning. I reached out to Dr. Nora Glass, I said. Petra blinked. Nora Glass? The Nora Glass who wrote her doctorate on Velchari power routing systems. That's the one. Callum. She's at the Institute on Wrench 4. She's not going to leave the Institute on Rainier Shen 4 to come work in a repair bay on Mira Station. I described the ship to her, I said. I described the experimental core designation. I sent her a photo of the access panel design and the core housing visible through the maintenance hatch. And? She responded in 40 minutes. Her message was 3 words. When do I start? Petra stared at me for 2 full seconds. Then she started laughing. And it was the real kind. The kind that meant something had caught her completely off guard. And she was delighted by it. That was the beginning. The crew call I put out brought 312 applications in 6 days. I read every single one. I didn't sleep much that week. By the end of it, I had a list of 8 names, and I spent the following week interviewing each of them over video link and in person. Where they were close enough, I was looking for something specific that was hard to name. It wasn't just skill, though skill mattered. It was a certain quality of mind. The kind that got energized by problems rather than discouraged by them. The kind that found not knowing a more interesting state than knowing. I found it in the people I chose. Nora Glass arrived on Mira Station 2 weeks after my initial message to her. She was 26 years old, had the kind of eyes that were always moving and computing, and brought 3 hard cases of equipment that she unpacked in the first hour. She looked at the ship's core housing through the maintenance hatch, said nothing for 4 minutes, and then said, very quietly, "This is the real thing." The experimental model, I said. Not just experimental. This is the prototype series before they even settled on the experimental design. This is the architecture they were testing before the test program. Callum, this thing has never been fully documented. There are no public records of this specific model. The Velchari don't even know it exists anymore, because whoever cataloged the ship after it was recovered from the debris field didn't know what they were looking at. I let that settle. What does that mean? Petra said, from where she was standing behind us. It means, Nora said, still looking at the core housing, that whatever is in there is genuinely unknown to everyone, including the people who built it. The third person who mattered most in those early months was Ivan Cole, who had been a welder and structural fabricator on long-haul cargo ships for 11 years, before an incident he described only as a disagreement with management about safety standards had left him freelancing. Ivan was 43, quiet in the way that people who are very certain of their own competence can be quiet, and he could read a metal surface the way some people read faces. He ran his hands along the hull of the ship on his first day, walked the full length of it in silence, came back to where I was standing and said, "The outer hull is worse than the survey said, but the inner structural frame is fine. Someone built this to last. Can we work with it?" I asked. We can do better than work with it, he said. We can make it honest. I wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that, but it turned out to be exactly the right framing for what we were about to do. The other 5 crew members each brought something essential. Lucy Byrne, who had worked in xenomedical logistics, and turned out to be the most organized person I had ever met in my life. She became the project manager, the keeper of the timeline, the person who somehow always knew where the missing tool was, and why the delivery of Parts 3 was delayed, and what we needed to order before we needed it. Glenn Hardy, an AI systems architect who had been on sabbatical from a military contract for reasons he called a philosophical disagreement about what AI should be used for, and who said almost nothing in our first interview, and then talked for 2 hours when I asked him what his ideal version of a shipboard navigation system would look like. 2 engineers from the University Cooperative on Mira, Owen Price and Diane Fletcher, who were technically between postings and who stayed for the full project. And finally, an older man named Archie Dunn, no relation to Petra, who had spent 20 years in drive system maintenance across 4 different species ship types, and who, when I showed him the Velcheri core housing, put on his reading glasses, looked at it for a long time, and said, "Well, this is going to be the most interesting year of my life, isn't it?" It ended up being 3 years, not 1. Archie didn't complain about that. The first 6 months were almost entirely deconstruction and documentation. We couldn't understand what we had until we had seen every part of it. Every system was opened, mapped, photographed from multiple angles, and then argued about over the most terrible instant coffee in the known galaxy. The station vending machine in the repair bay corridor had been malfunctioning for approximately 8 years, and the coffee it produced was something that existed in a category of its own, between beverage and industrial solvent. We drank it anyway, because it was there and we were always tired. Nora worked on the core. She slept less than any of us, and she had the specific habit of leaving handwritten notes on every surface near her workstation. Actual handwriting, on actual paper, because she said she thought better when her hand was moving. By the end of the first month, she had covered an entire section of the bay wall in notes, diagrams, questions. I stood in front of that wall one evening and tried to follow the thread of it, and gave up after about 20 minutes. Nora came and stood next to me. "Does it make sense to you?" I asked. "Not yet," she said, "but it's getting closer." What she found, over the following weeks, changed the project from interesting to extraordinary. The Velcheri, in designing the experimental core, had been working on a thermal routing system that used heat not just as a byproduct to be managed, but as a functional component of the power cycle itself. The idea was not unique to them. Human engineers had theorized about similar systems, but the Velcheri had implemented it in a way that was genuinely novel. The problem they had never solved was efficiency. The system produced significantly more power than a standard core, but it also wasted a significant amount of that power as heat that couldn't be cycled back into the process. The test program had closed because they couldn't solve the thermal waste problem. Nora had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, when she came to find me in the bay at 11 at night, with her tablet in her hand, and a look on her face that I had come to recognize as her version of barely controlled excitement. "I found something," she said. She showed me a paper published 7 years ago by 2 engineers at the Human Institute of Applied Thermodynamics on Earth. It was a study of thermal cycling in heavy industrial furnaces, completely unrelated to spacecraft propulsion. The paper described a method of recovering waste heat by using a secondary cycling architecture, a system within a system, effectively, that had been dismissed in the industrial context because it added too much complexity for the applications being studied. "They solved the waste problem," Nora said. "They solved it for a completely different reason, in a completely different context, and then filed it away because it wasn't useful to them. But if you apply this to the Velcheri core architecture, the efficiency problem goes away," I said. "Not just goes away. The output potential goes up if the math holds. And Callum, I've been running it for 6 hours and the math holds. This core doesn't just match standard Velcheri output. It exceeds it by roughly 40%. I sat down on a storage crate. 40%. That was not an incremental improvement. That was a different category of performance entirely. How confident are you? I said. Confident enough to want to build it and find out, she said. I looked at her. She looked at me. We were both quiet for a moment. Build it, I said. That was month 4. In month 7, Archie and Nora together completed the first functional assembly of the hybrid core. Velchari crystalline lattice architecture, with the human thermal cycling method, integrated into the routing system. It was not elegant to look at. It was, in Archie's words, a beautiful mess that would horrify a Velchari engineer and delight a human one. The connection points between the original Velchari components and the new cycling infrastructure required custom fabrication of parts that did not exist anywhere and had to be designed from scratch. Even built 3 versions of the primary coupling before he found one that satisfied him, and the third version, the one we used, was something I genuinely couldn't have imagined before he made it. While Nora and Archie worked on the core, Glenn was building the navigation system. He had explained his philosophical disagreement to me in full, one evening when we were working late and the bay was quiet. The military contract he had left had been to develop an AI system for a patrol vessel, and the system he had been building was a single sovereign intelligence, one AI, in full control of all navigation decisions, with no checks on its reasoning. Glenn had believed this was the wrong approach, not because the AI would make bad decisions, but because any single decision-making system, however capable, had blind spots that it could not see, because they were blind spots. He had proposed a cooperative model instead, multiple AI systems running in parallel, cross-checking each other in real time, capable of reaching consensus but also of flagging disagreement, and had been told this was too complex and too slow. Was it too slow? I asked. In simulation, the cooperative model added an average of 0.3 seconds to decision time, he said. For navigation decisions on a patrol vessel, that's negligible. For anything except actual combat, it's not even worth measuring. And the benefit? The benefit was that it almost never catastrophically failed, he said. A single AI, if its core reasoning makes an error, can make that error consistently and completely. 3 AI systems cross-checking each other will disagree before they all make the same error. The probability of a shared catastrophic failure across 3 independent systems is so low it's almost theoretical. I thought about that. Build it, I said, which was becoming a habit of mine. Glenn built 3 separate navigation AI systems over 8 months, each with a different reasoning architecture, all able to communicate with each other in real time. He called them internally by color: red, blue, green. Not because of any hierarchy, but because he needed to distinguish them in his notes. Red was the fastest, blue was the most conservative, green was, in Glenn's words, the curious one. It had a tendency to notice things the other 2 hadn't flagged, and to ask questions that turned out to be the right questions. He loved green best, though he would never admit it directly. The decision to remove the weapon systems entirely was mine, and it was not impulsive. I had been thinking about it for 4 months before I said it out loud, because I knew it would generate the most discussion, and I wanted to be sure before I put it in front of the crew. We had one team meeting about it. I laid out the situation. The original weapon systems were too degraded to restore without essentially building new weapons from scratch. Velchari weapons technology was not something we had the technical knowledge to replicate. We could attempt a human weapons retrofit, but that would require permits, inspections, and a level of bureaucratic engagement with both human and interstellar regulatory bodies that would delay the project by 2 years minimum. Those were the practical reasons. I told them the practical reasons first. Then I told them the real reason. I said, I don't want to put a weapon into this ship. This ship has been a warship. It has been part of whatever conflict left it drifting in the Shatter Arm for 111 years. I want to make it something else. I want to make it something that, when it goes out into the galaxy, goes out to help, and to learn, and to be useful in a way that doesn't end in someone being harmed. I waited for the pushback. Ivan said, after a moment, "What do you put in its place?" I told him, Medical Bay, expanded from the ship's original small crew medical station into something large enough to treat multiple species simultaneously. Laboratory spaces, 3 of them, designed for open research. The room near the bridge with the intact display wall would become a communications and cultural exchange suite. Orders for 36, because the ship could carry more crew than we needed, and extra space meant the ability to take on guests, refugees, researchers, whoever needed a passage, and a sensor suite. Nora had found the sensor hardpoints during the initial survey, the external mounting infrastructure for a sensor array that the Velchari had never fully installed on this vessel, presumably because the war ended before they got to it. The hardpoints were there, ready, just waiting for something to be mounted on them. What we designed and built over the final year was the largest, most capable long-range sensor suite ever installed on a vessel of this size class. Not because we were trying to make a record, but because the hardpoints could hold it and the power core, once finished, could run it without strain. The sensor suite was Lucy's project in the final stages. She had no formal sensor engineering background, but she had spent 6 months absorbing everything about sensor design that existed in the public record. And she had a particular gift for understanding what information was actually useful versus what was merely available. The suite she oversaw the installation of didn't just collect data. It interpreted it, cross-referenced it against multiple star chart databases, and flagged discrepancies automatically. It was the sensor suite that would, in the ship's first year of operation, produce more useful astronomical data than 3 standard survey vessels combined. But I didn't know that yet. What I knew, as we entered the final months of the project, was that the ship was becoming something, not what it had been, not what anyone would have expected when I raised my hand in that auction room for 12,000 credits, something entirely its own. Lucy came to me 6 weeks before the projected completion date, with a question I hadn't expected. "What are we going to call her?" she said. I had been so focused on the building that I had genuinely not thought about the name. Ships have names. This one had a registry designation, and an old Velchari name, the Kelmora, which translated roughly as the Enduring Blade, but neither of those felt right anymore. The Kelmora was what she had been. She was not that anymore. I thought about it for 3 days. I asked the crew for suggestions over dinner one evening, and the conversation that followed was one of the best hours of that whole 3-year project. Everyone at the table, tired and honest and a little silly from exhaustion, proposing names and arguing about them and laughing at the bad ones. Glenn proposed something mathematical that nobody else understood. Ivan suggested something short and defiant that I seriously considered. Petra proposed something warm and specific that made Nora tear up slightly and then deny it. The name I chose came from something my grandfather had said to me years before, when I asked him why he kept fixing things that most people would have thrown away. He had looked at me over the engine he was working on, that same motorcycle engine from the garage as it happened, and said, "The small things are the ones that stay when everything else gives up." I named her the stubbornness of small things. Archie said it was a ridiculous name for a ship of that size. I said that was exactly why it was right. The launch was not a grand event. We did not send formal invitations. There were no dignitaries, no speeches, no gathered crowd of onlookers waiting for the great moment. The bay doors opened at 6 in the morning, station time, and the crew of 12, we had added a few more in the final months, technical and medical personnel, were at their stations, and I was in the bridge chair, and we flew. The first thing that happened was the core. Archie counted down the startup sequence from the engineering bay in the tone of a man trying very hard to sound calm. Nora was at the monitoring station next to him, running checks on the thermal cycling integration every 30 seconds. The core came online in stages, the way all cores do. First the base lattice, then the routing circuits, then the thermal cycling system. We had run ground tests. The ground tests had been excellent, but a ground test is a controlled environment, and a first flight is not. The core came fully online at 6:14 in the morning. Nora's voice came over the bay channel. She said 3 words. 43% above. 43% above baseline projection. The math had been right. The system worked. The hybrid core ran better in flight than it had in any simulation or test, because the thermal cycling became more efficient under actual propulsion load. which was exactly what the theoretical model had predicted, but which none of us had quite let ourselves fully believe, until we saw the numbers come up live. I sat in that bridge chair. The same chair. The original chair that had been sitting empty on a dead ship for 111 years. And I listened to my crew reporting in across channels, one by one. And every single report was good. And I looked at the forward display showing the station receding behind us, and the open dark ahead, and I felt something that I still don't have a completely accurate word for. Not pride, not triumph, something more like rightness, the feeling that a thing is exactly where it belongs. The first 12 hours of flight were dense with data. The sensor suite came fully online in the second hour, and immediately began doing what it was designed to do. 30 minutes after activation, green, the Curious Navigation AI, flagged a gravitational anomaly 200 light-minutes off our starboard side. It cross-referenced the anomaly against 5 different stellar survey databases and produced a corrected coordinate map showing that 3 of those databases had the same small but significant error in the region's charting, an error that had propagated from one survey to the next for 60 years because nobody had put a sensor array of sufficient resolution in that area to catch it. It took Green 40 minutes to produce a corrected chart segment that would have taken a dedicated survey mission weeks. Lucy pulled up the comparison on the main display and looked at it. "That's already useful," she said. "Yes," I said. "And we haven't even left the local system yet." "No," I said. In the third hour, the Velchari patrol vessel appeared. I had known it was a possibility. Velchari patrol routes through this region were documented, and Mira Station sat in an area with intermittent patrol coverage. I had not particularly worried about it, because we had done nothing wrong and had nothing to hide. But I had also not forgotten the Velchari ambassador's description of the Kelmora as not worth the administrative cost of recovery. The patrol vessel hailed us on standard interstellar Channel 3. Its commander, whose designation translated in standard trade language as Fleet Officer 37-9, spoke with the flat efficiency of someone who had hailed 1,000 vessels in their career and was not expecting this one to be interesting. Then they ran our registry signature. The registry signature of the stubbornness of small things still carried the base identifier of the original Velchari vessel. It had to, by interstellar law, the chain of ownership had to be traceable. So when Fleet Officer 37-9 ran our identifier, what came back was the old designation of the Kelmora, stricken from the Velchari register 111 years ago. The transmission went silent for 11 seconds. 11 seconds is a very long time in open-channel communication between vessels. It means something has stopped the person on the other end. It means the situation has not matched their expectation in a way they are still processing. When the fleet officer spoke again, the voice had changed slightly. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. Registry match confirms vessel is former Velchari Conservancy designation, Kelmora, stricken 111 years prior. Please confirm current status and ownership. I activated the transmit channel. I said, "We bought it. We fixed it. Good morning." Another silence. Shorter this time. 5 seconds. "Please confirm. Human registry. Mira Station. Earth 7 Alpha 3. Confirmed. The Kelmora has been modified." "Significantly," I said, "we can provide full technical documentation if your conservancy is interested. We're operating under standard independent research and medical charter. You're welcome to inspect if you'd like." The patrol vessel did not respond for a full minute. Then, "We will note this vessel's position and registry in the patrol log. You are cleared to proceed." They did not inspect us. I thought about that for a while afterward, what they saw on their screens. What they made of the sensor returns from a hull they recognized by bone structure, but couldn't read by system signature. I wondered if Fleet Officer 37-9 went back to their patrol base that day and told someone what they had encountered. I suspected they did. I was right about that. I found out later that the Velchari Conservancy received a patrol report about an unknown vessel operating on the Kelmora's old registry signature within 4 hours of our encounter. Within 24 hours, there were 17 vessels in the broader region that had our position logged. The news moved fast. By hour 8, we were receiving signals from frequencies we weren't broadcasting on, passive monitoring traffic, the interstellar equivalent of people craning their necks to look. By hour 20, two Quarath news networks were running brief items about an unspecified vessel operating in the Mira region on an old Velchari registry, and the items had the particular quality of pieces written by journalists who didn't have enough information yet, but knew something was interesting. By hour 36, we received a formal diplomatic communication from the Velchari Conservancy. The communication was addressed to the operator of the vessel operating on registry designation, formerly known as Kel Mora, and it requested that we cease operation of what the Velchari Conservancy described as a vessel of cultural heritage and enter into formal consultations regarding ownership and disposition. I read the message 3 times. I thought about the auction house. I thought about the gavel coming down. I thought about 12,000 credits and the Quarath laughter, and not worth the administrative cost of recovery. I drafted a response. I kept it short. I reminded the Velchari Conservancy that the vessel had been lawfully sold at public auction, in full compliance with interstellar property law, after the Conservancy had declined to exercise its right of recovery. I noted the transfer documentation, the sale price, and the date. I thanked them for their interest, and invited them to review the full technical charter of our operation, which was publicly filed. I signed it with my full name and the vessel registry. I sent it. Then, because I had learned something about timing from years of negotiating parts contracts and repair deals, I turned off active monitoring on that communication channel for 48 hours. Not permanently, just long enough to let the response, and the silence that followed it, do their own work. On the same day I received the Velchari message, an unofficial communication arrived from the Quarath Merchant Guild. It was not addressed formally. It arrived on a trade frequency, worded as a general inquiry. It asked about the technical specifications of any modifications made to propulsion systems currently operating under the Kelmora Registry Identifier. I did not respond to that one immediately either, but I filed it with some interest. The Velchari eventually dropped the cultural heritage claim. It took 8 months, 2 rounds of formal correspondence, and 1 meeting with a Velchari legal representative, who spent most of the meeting looking at the sensor data we had collected in our first month of operation, with an expression I came to think of as involuntary respect, the look of someone who had expected to be unimpressed, and found that they couldn't quite manage it. They sent an ambassador after that, a young one, recently assigned to Interstellar Research Liaison. Her name translated to something approximate in trade language as First Voice of the New, which I thought was either a meaningful assignment or a very good coincidence. She arrived on board with 2 hard cases of equipment of her own, monitoring devices, data collectors, the tools of someone who intended to observe carefully and record everything, and she spent 3 weeks on the stubbornness of small things. She was the most consistently curious being I have ever spent extended time with. She asked questions about everything, not the defensive questions of someone looking for flaws, but the open questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand how things worked, and why decisions had been made the way they were. She spent most of 1 full day in the laboratory with Nora, who explained the thermal cycling integration in patient and thorough detail, and the Velchari ambassador sat across the table and listened, and occasionally said something that suggested she was following not just the explanation but the reasoning behind it. On her last evening aboard, she came to find me on the bridge. I was running through the next leg of our route, checking the sensor data from the day against the star charts, doing the quiet domestic work of navigation that happens between the interesting moments. She sat in the co-pilot chair and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I read the original design documents for the Kelmora before it was built. Before the conflict, the engineers who designed it had plans for it that were never implemented, because the conflict priorities changed what the ship became. What kind of plans? I said. A medical bay, she said. Laboratories. Extended range sensor arrays. They wanted to build a vessel that could operate independently in long-range exploration, with full scientific capability. The conflict required a different kind of ship, and the design changed to meet that requirement. After the conflict, the program was closed. I looked at the forward display, the open dark, the star field that the sensor suite was quietly and continuously mapping. "So we built what it was supposed to be," I said. "Yes," she said. "More or less exactly, with some differences we did not anticipate." "The power core," I said. "The power core," she said, "and the navigation system, and several other things. But those are the most significant." She paused. "Our engineers have been studying the navigation mesh design since the papers were published. There is significant discussion." "Good discussion or concerned discussion?" I said. She considered this. "Both," she said, which is probably the appropriate response. She left the next morning with her 2 hard cases and a copy of every technical document we had produced over the 3-year project, which we shared freely because that had been our intention from the beginning. She shook my hand at the airlock in the way she had learned humans did it. She had been practicing, which I found quietly touching. And she said before she left, the engineers who built the original Kelmora would have been pleased. I did not know what to say to that. So I said thank you, and she nodded, and she left. It was Glenn who told me about the Velchari ambassador's address to the Conservancy Council 3 months later. Glenn had set up a passive monitor on public Velchari broadcast channels, partly for navigation data, and partly because he was curious about everything. He came to find me one morning with a transcript. The old ambassador, the one who had been in the auction room, who had heard me bid 12,000 credits for his government's junk, had addressed the council about the Kelmora situation. Glenn gave me the translated summary. The ambassador had said, in formal Velchari address language, that the vessel now registered as the stubbornness of small things represented an outcome that was not anticipated, that human modification of Velchari technology had produced results that were worthy of serious study, that the navigation architecture in particular had implications for Velchari vessel design that the Conservancy was not yet prepared to dismiss. I asked Glenn if the transcript included any notes on the ambassador's tone. Glenn said, "The formal register doesn't really capture tone, but the council secretary's notation at the end of the address says that the ambassador reviewed the recording of the Galactic Assembly address twice before delivering this speech. Apparently he watches things more than once when they affect him." I thought about that for a while. The Galactic Assembly address. I had not intended to give one. I had been operating the stubbornness of small things for about 14 months when the invitation arrived, and it came through official channels. A formal request from the Assembly's Scientific Liaison Committee, asking if the operator of the vessel could speak to the Assembly about the technical and design philosophy behind the project. The invitation listed several areas of specific interest, including the hybrid core architecture, the cooperative navigation system, and the rationale for the sensor suite configuration. It did not list the decision to remove the weapons systems as an area of specific interest. I noticed that. I went. Nora came with me, as technical lead. Petra came, because she had been there from the start, and I wasn't going to leave her out of this. The assembly chamber on the platform station above Rien 7 held 2,416 seats, and every one of them was occupied. I had addressed large rooms before, not this large. I spoke for 40 minutes. I explained the core architecture and the thermal cycling integration, which generated genuine interest from the engineering and science representatives. I explained the cooperative navigation mesh, which generated longer discussion and several written questions submitted through the floor system. I explained the sensor suite and the data we had collected, which the assembly already had access to because we published all of our findings openly, but which generated a particular quality of silence when I described the rate at which it had been correcting errors in the standard stellar charts. Then I came to the question. One of the assembly delegates, from a species I recognized but whose name I am not certain I can render accurately here, asked why we had removed the weapons systems from a vessel of that class, given the security advantages such systems provide. I looked at the delegate. I looked at the room. I said that the weapons systems had been irrecoverable, and that we had not had the technical knowledge to replicate Velchari armament. Those were the practical facts. I said them. Then I said the real thing. I said that we had also made a choice, that replacing the weapons had not been just a practical decision, but an intentional one, that we had a ship that had been built for conflict, and we had decided to make it something built for something else, because we had enough of the former and not enough of the latter. I said that humans had spent a very significant portion of our history building things designed to cause harm, that we knew that territory well, that we understood conflict and its economics, and its logic and its aftermath, better than most species who had not had as much of it as we had. I said that knowing something well is not the same as wanting more of it, that understanding violence does not make you want to produce it, that knowing the cost of a thing, in detail and from experience, can make you very clear about what you want to build instead. I said, we didn't put the stubbornness of small things into the galaxy to add to what was already there. We put it in to add to what there wasn't enough of. The chamber held 2,416 sentient beings from dozens of different species, representing hundreds of different cultures and histories and ways of being in the universe. They were very quiet for a long time. Not an uncomfortable quiet, a thinking quiet, the kind of silence that happens when something lands somewhere real. Nora found my hand under the table and squeezed it once. I don't think she knew she did it. I did not say anything. The session resumed. There were more technical questions. There was a motion to request ongoing access to our published research, which passed without opposition. There was a formal acknowledgement entered into the assembly record of the significant contribution to interstellar scientific knowledge, represented by the first 14 months of operational data from the vessel. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, a delegate from one of the species I didn't know well came to speak to me through a translation unit. The delegate was small and moved carefully, and looked at me with what I read as genuine puzzlement. They asked, through the unit, is this a common human approach to take old broken things and make them into something useful and peaceful? I thought about my grandfather's garage, about the motorcycle engine, about the particular quality of satisfaction that comes from understanding something well enough to make it run again. It's something we do, I said. Some of us, when we can. The delegate was quiet for a moment. Then they said, it seems like a good thing to do. I agreed with them. The stubbornness of small things is still flying. I am writing this from the small cabin behind the bridge that serves as my quarters and office, in the quiet of late shift, while the rest of the crew sleeps, and the ship moves through a region of space that was not on any current chart when we passed through it 3 years ago. It is on the chart now. Green flagged it, red confirmed it, blue filed the submission. The Korath Merchant Guild did eventually get their response, by the way. It took me about 6 weeks to draft something I was satisfied with. I shared our published thermal cycling research openly, as we shared everything, and noted where to find it in the public archive. I did not enter into any private licensing arrangement. I did not charge for the information. I received a formal reply from the guild that described this approach as atypical, and then requested a meeting to discuss potential commercial arrangements. I declined the meeting. I directed them to the public archive again. I wished them well with their reading. Nora told me afterward that 2 separate Korath engineering consortiums and 1 Velchari technical working group had begun independent verification projects based on the published thermal cycling research. She said this with a quiet satisfaction that was, I thought, the most appropriate possible response to the information. That is what we built. The stubbornness of small things to do, not to own an advantage, to put something useful into the world, and let the world do what it wanted with it. I think about the auction sometimes. The amber light and the cold hull key, and the Korath laughter. The Velchari ambassador who was there to observe the disposal of something his government had decided was beneath their attention. 12,000 credits. The gavel coming down. I think about what the galaxy expected to happen next. I think they expected nothing. I think they expected the ship to sit in a repair bay and rust at a different rate than it had been rusting in the shatter arm. I think they expected that the human who had paid 12,000 credits for a joke would eventually come to see the humor in it and write it off as an expensive mistake. They did not expect us to open it and find out what was inside. They did not expect us to ask what the ship had been trying to be before the conflict changed it into something else. They did not expect us to spend 3 years answering that question. They did not expect us to fly. That is, I think, the most accurate description of what astonished the galaxy, not the power core, not the navigation mesh, not the sensor data, though all of those contributed. What astonished them was the simpler thing underneath all of it, that we looked at something everyone else had looked at, and seen garbage, and we saw a question. And then we spent everything we had, time, money, sleep, 3 years of instant coffee that tasted like it came from a malfunctioning machine because it did, trying to answer it. Humans do that. Some of us, when we can. We find the broken things and we ask what they were trying to be. It turns out the galaxy was not expecting that. It turns out the galaxy had not, perhaps, seen enough of it. I am of the opinion that we can fix that. I look at the forward display, at the dark full of things that don't have names yet. I think, well, let's get to work.